we still have some ways to go in reforming non-productive parts of our labor laws. To sustain manufacturing competitiveness, it's important that there is both availability and low cost of capital. Here, we've seen a lot more liquidity in India. Today, in fact, most industries are able to raise funds at very competitive rates, and there is growing global accessibility to funds. Nevertheless, here again, there remains a minor source of competitive disadvantage with China. Now, one may argue that the situation in China is quite a bit different given the nature of their FDI inflows and the role of the state in terms of funding and investment. As far as infrastructure is concerned, I think this is a common cocktail hour subject. We've talked about the roads, we've talked about the poor availability of infrastructure. It's ironic that at a time when our airlines have been deregulated and we've talked about airlines coming out of the woodwork and being prepared to order a 100 aircraft fleet, we don't have even the biggest airport in our country, Mumbai's airport, capable of handling anywhere near the kind of air traffic we expect. Now, when one extends this kind of discussion to the ports, the roadway network, I think there is no doubt that there is a lot to be achieved. And this is, again, going back to this analogy to China, in remarkable contrast to the way infrastructure has happened in China. Even the secondary cities in China, even in the more remote locations, can claim to have brand new airports and air terminals that really put in shade the kinds of airports and terminals we see either in Europe or North America. I had the privilege at one time of visiting a very remote corner of China, literally across a small river from North Korea. But to get there, I was driven on a 4-lane motorway, which was constructed to better standards than most US interstates, with 5 tunnels, each of which were at least 4 kilometers long. So the kind of infrastructure that China has really brought to bear on solving some of its problems have been phenomenal. And I think they've done it with a single-minded focus on making sure that infrastructure is available for economic development. We have a long way to go in India, even though, as Professor Anand mentioned, there is something to cheer about. The Golden Quadrilateral, the Prime Minister's Gram Sadak Yojana campaign are all positive steps that the government is taking to create critical necessary infrastructure. I myself practically commute between Bombay and Pune at least 2 or 3 times every week, and it is my prediction that within the next 10 years, Pune will be no more than a suburb of Bombay, and it is fostered by the kind of highway connections that are getting created. So, in terms of logistics, infrastructure, here too, India lags China in its competitiveness. And while we've noted the progress that's being made, I think one must constantly keep our eyes on how fast China is moving ahead. Now, as far as the other props for manufacturing competitiveness, government policies, I think here too, one can see a much more focused and in some cases a very single-minded approach that one sees adopted in China. A democratic system like ours does not allow such a clean and such a brisk movement towards a reform. The auto policy that has been enacted in China is a very single-minded document aimed at fostering the creation of large Chinese multinationals in the auto sector. And while others debate about the validity of some of the provisions as far as WTO regulations are concerned, I think the Chinese have spent more time, they've not spent time worrying about the WTO consequences. They have spent more time worrying about how they're going to make their organizations and the auto companies strong multinational companies, And I think this single-mindedness in making sure that their industries are competitive has shown in the way they've been able to march very, very rapidly in the last few years. Having said that, I think there is nothing wrong with open trade, bringing down of trade barriers, and the forging of mutually beneficial regional alliances. But I think the key word here would be to ensure a level playing field, to ensure that one's industries, one's country's industries, remain competitive and enjoy a level playing field within which they must prove their competitiveness. So if you look at India, one of the biggest sources of this cost disadvantage is the cascading and the cumulative taxes and duties, which itself account for over 18% of this cost disadvantage. So yes, manufacturing in India is getting competitive. We're gearing ourselves up to be more globally competitive, but yet we have a ways to go in terms of addressing the kind of change and the pace that China is setting. Now, lest I be perceived as attributing manufacturing competitiveness to government policy or external factors, clearly there's much that organizations would have to do themselves to make sure that they are globally competitive. And if we want to take a look at what are the critical steps organizations have had to take to leverage all of the external factors, but craft an independent strategy towards competitiveness, I think one finds similar pathways. Professor Krishna Palepu, who is a well-known professor from the Harvard School of Business, a good friend of mine, has been working with a number of organizations, including ours, to look at how do organizations, corporations from emerging economies transform themselves to become truly multinational manufacturing organizations. I think there is a very, very typical pattern that one sees in all the success stories, and without appearing to be prescriptive about how this may be done, I think it is worthwhile to look at how this pattern has evolved. Typically, it starts with strength in the domestic market. Seldom have multinationals evolved without having established dominance or a degree of stability in their domestic market. I think a lot of work has been done to study one of these brands. I will use in this example the brand Haier, a Chinese white goods manufacturer that literally came out of nowhere to being now one of the top 4 white goods manufacturers in the world. It started, of course, with addressing products for the Chinese market, and in some small ways, uniquely tailored to what they felt the Chinese customers wanted. And very quickly, they became the #1 white goods manufacturer in China, with domination in a range of white goods, including refrigerators, washing machines, etc. Once they had achieved some amount of strength in their domestic market, they went about looking at market adjacencies. They wanted to get into markets that resembled the Chinese market, where they would have success taking products that had been proven and tested in their domestic market. And they went into countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. Essentially, the products were similar to what they'd already had and proven in China, and they were able to use the muscle and the scale of what they'd built up in China to become dominant players in these adjacent markets. When they had reached that stage, they then decided to tackle some of the more developed country markets. But here, rather than go head-on against the majors present there, they decided to get into sectors or segments that were playing to their advantage. For instance, when they went into the North American and the European markets, they went into segments with refrigerators, for example. Instead of going to the household refrigerator, they went into these very small mini refrigerators, typically used in university dormitories and so on. A refrigerator like this would sell for about $49. This was a market that none of the US or the European multinationals were really interested in getting to. The margins were brutal, and this gave Haier, a company like Haier, a tremendous entry and a tremendous volume to get into, which they leveraged their low-cost base to success. And so today, I think most of us have heard of Haier. They're here in India. They've had successes in a number of product segments. They've overtaken so many well-known, highly reputed brands around the world. And today they're ranked 89th amongst the 500 most influential brands globally. So in a very short period of time, China was able to demonstrate one example of growing a Chinese multinational. If we come a little closer to home now, I think if I'm allowed to say a short story about what it is that we at Tata Motors have been doing, I think Tata Motors too recognized that for manufacturing competitiveness, we would have to start with leveraging much of our technical and R&D capabilities. And for this, for well over 2 or 3 decades now, the company has invested in a very capable, well-staffed R&D organization that is truly state-of-the-art in most of the critical departments or critical areas of activity. This was backed up with what I would call optimally automated production facilities. We've chosen a strategy of not being tight with money when automation was going to be valuable for either product quality or productivity, but at the same time keeping in mind Indian labor costs and labor flexibility as a means of achieving a more investment efficient manufacturing footprint. As a result, one can claim that we at Tata Motors were able to transform a pasture of land seen on the top left page into a fairly state-of-the-art auto manufacturing facility with an engine plant, a body shop, a paint shop, a full vehicle assembly line, and fund the development of a new platform, a family of vehicles, an architecture, so to say, with a number of derivatives, including the very successful Indica, the Indigo sedan, and the Marina station wagon. The entire investment for all of this was about a little over $500 million US. Now, in the auto industry, and even my own experience from working outside of the country, it's not uncommon for a multinational to go from one product generation to the next, in going from an existing range of products to the next generation of products, and incur a ticket of well over $1 billion. So inherently here, it points to a tremendous source of advantage in India in terms of translating investment rupees or investment dollars into product revenue. Now, we too wanted to make sure that without necessarily following a playbook, wanted to execute a strategy that would take us over a period of time to being a credible global player. And it did start with to achieve strength in our domestic market. Now, we were and have been for over 4 decades now a dominant commercial vehicle manufacturer in India with a market share of over 67%. But when we went into the passenger car business, we faced an array of competitors with at least 14 global OEMs present in India, manufacturing or assembling vehicles in India across almost all of the product segments that you see listed here. So we went about developing our range of products, but going back to saying, what is it that we could do differently compared to the other 14 global OEMs who were here? And indeed, it had to go back to saying, do we understand the Indian customer better than these global OEMs can? And can we configure our products to be that much more uniquely tailored to offer this Indian customer really what they want? And so whether it was with Indica, which had a rather well-defined mission, a mission handed down by Mr. Ratan Tata, which said, I want a car that's as big as the Ambassador on the inside and as small as a Maruti Zen on the outside. It should have the fuel economy of a Maruti 800, but it should have the safety of a much larger car. Now, these were all mission briefs and product briefs that the team worked very hard to achieve. And indeed, what emerged was an Indica. It was not much bigger than a Zen on the outside. It is the biggest B-segment car available in the market. With a diesel engine, it offers an operating cost far less than even the operating cost of a Maruti 800, and yet in a crash test, it will outperform most of the B segment cars that are available in the market. And so indeed, we delivered to the Indian customer a little more of what they wanted, a big small car. And that experiment and that philosophy carried over with the Indigo, where we observed that while a C segment car is a small car for most global manufacturers, because whether you're in Europe or in North America, a car like the Hyundai Accent or a Ford Icon is a college graduate's car. Here, a car like the Icon or the Indigo is really used by an executive and typically, not uncommonly, driven by a chauffeur. So we focused on the rear compartment of the car, and as a result, the Indigo had the biggest rear seat space. It had more headroom, legroom, and shoulder room than even cars one segment larger than this segment. And with the operating economics of a diesel and the refinement improvements that we had made, it became the best-selling B segment car right from the first month that it was launched, and today, even today, remains the best-selling entry-level mid-size car. So it went back to making sure we understood what the Indian customer wanted and building a